Good afternoon. Welcome to the Chai Academy, coming to you from the Chai Center. Chai Academy is a few times a week we gather together and we discuss various topics of Jewish interest. And we've been doing for the past 10 times, 12 times, we've been doing modern day Israel. Just this fascinating tour, if you will, historical tour from 1948 or 47, if you will, and then we're holding approximately 1978, when finally Menachem Begin from the Likud became prime minister. So from 48 all the way to 77, there was one party basically ruled the roost, and then finally Menachem Begin. And we discussed Begin and Sadat, and we discussed them in previous courses, and you can gladly find them if you're tuning in for the first time at thechaicenter.com/academy, or likewise, you may also choose to go to our YouTube channel, which is the Chai Academy. So we today we are going to continue the course, and we're going to be talking about the Lebanese War, the Lebanon War, a very troubling time in history of Israel. But before we start that, let's talk about the Peace Now movement. So we've discussed in the past the Gush Emunim, the block of the believers, who are they're right wing, and they want to basically take revenge on every single terrorist, Palestinian terrorist and PLO, etc. And they don't want to give up any inch of land. So you have a counterbalance. You have something called Shalom Achshav, the Peace Now movement. So however right the Gush Emunim are, the Peace Now activists are pretty left. And it basically, when did the Peace Now, and I'm talking about the Peace Now movement for a reason, because they did something quite remarkable. But it was founded in 1978 when Begin and Sadat first started to talk about gaining a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. So there were many people who were concerned, because Begin is a hawk. Begin was never a dove. And now finally there's peace talks with Egypt, but it's with Begin. And so therefore 350 military officers, reservists, so they're not active in the military, but once a year they have to come and fill their obligation. They wrote a public letter, and they signed it with their names. So it wasn't an anonymous letter, but rather it was 350 reservist officers who wrote and signed a public letter out of concern that this peace agreement will not take place because Begin's a hawk. And so that was the beginning of the Peace Now, Shalom Achshav movement. In September, when the negotiations were going on between Begin and Sadat, 100,000 people, right? They gathered together in Tel Aviv to demand that Begin make peace with Sadat, and there will be peace between Israel and Egypt. Of course, nobody likes war. When there's a war, people die. Peace is much better. Of course, peace is much better. So once peace was made between Egypt and Israel, now the Shalom Achshav movement, the Peace Now movement, turned their attention towards the West Bank. They turned towards the Green Line, the 67 borders, and turned to the fact that we need to give Palestinians their some land and their right to exist. And what's interesting to know, what was incredible, is in 1982 there were 400,000 people demonstrated. 400,000. Now, at that time, there were 4 million people in the country. So 400,000 is 10% of the country's population had a protest in Tel Aviv. And their protest was because of the Lebanon War. And it's interesting, at that protest, there was a grenade thrown, and somebody died. She was an activist, and she died. And I think that is when you began to see the divide in Israel of the Jewish people, of the right and the left. And it's the acrimony built from there. But so you have right, who don't want to give up an inch. You have left, who would throw out the baby with the bathwater if allowed. And they don't get along. But what was the Lebanese War? So first of all, it's the longest war in Israel's history, and it began as a noble endeavor. The entire population of Israel, the civilians, the military, the political branch, they were all in agreement. Something had to be done about the PLO terrorists on the southern Lebanese border. So southern Lebanon translates into northern Israel, the Galilee. And basically the PLO terrorists were shelling northern Israel from South Lebanon, right? And they had incursions, attacks, etc. And it was all on their southern border, Israel's northern border. And so everybody was in agreement that we have to go in there and we have to eliminate the PLO terrorists. And then there can be peace. You get rid of the PLO terrorists, which of course was the ultimate terrorist was Yasser Arafat. And the name, every war in the United States, Israel, etc., they have a name. So there's Operation Cast Lead, and right. This one was called Operation Peace in Galilee, as they truly believed that if they can get rid of the PLO terrorists, there will be peace. Right? There was a nickname, in other words, a nickname for this war, and it was called Arik's War, because the defense minister was Arik Sharon, who eventually became the prime minister, and he was very, very tough guy. He was a hawk, etc., and he had tremendous success. I mean, in the 6-Day War, the man was brilliant, and but he was yearning. He was itching to get into Lebanon. So what Israel didn't realize, and they probably should have realized, but you can't realize everything, is that Lebanon is insane. Lebanon is not just a country where the PLO terrorists gathered at their southern border. Lebanon was made up of hostile groups, very tribal. So you had the Maronite Christians, you had the Sunni Muslim, you had the Shiite Muslim, you had the Palestinians in refugee camps, you had the Druze, and each one hated each other. And the infighting between them all was something that Israel didn't realize how difficult it proved to be, as we'll hear. So this war actually kind of it started in 1979 when Israel formed an alliance with the Maronite Christians, but it escalated in 1982. So Israel formed an alliance with the Maronite Christians because they felt that they could keep the Muslims and the terrorists mainly out of the way. So the Maronite Christians and they did. Now the Maronite Christians and the Israelis formed this alliance. Aside from the PLO terrorists, they also had a problem with Syria. Syria believes, I believe until today, that Lebanon is really their territory. that Lebanon is not a separate country. Lebanon is an extension of Syria. So therefore, when they formed the alliance with Israel, they knew that Lebanon was somewhat protected, and Israel knew that the Maronite Christians in Lebanon will keep the PLO at bay. So it was an alliance of convenience. It was a strategic alliance. And that's how it was from 1979 and to June 1982. So the Maronite Christians served as a buffer. But in June 1982, the ambassador to the United Kingdom, Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, Shlomo Argav, I think his name was, Shlomo Argav, was mortally wounded in an attack in England by the PLO. It wasn't Arafat's PLO, it was Arafat's enemy's PLO, Abu Nidal, but regardless, it was the PLO. So Israel retaliated. You attack PLO and attacks our ambassador on foreign soil. So Israel started to bomb the PLO in Lebanon. PLO started to shell into northern Israel. So Israel said, "Okay, we're going in. Now we're going in," and this is kind of when the war started. It was June 1982. Israel went in and they invaded Lebanon. Their mandate was very clear. 25 miles. You go into Lebanon, 25 miles, and you get rid of every PLO terrorist you could find. Weaken them to the point that they are just no more. Now, Arik Sharon, as I said, was a hawk, so they seemed to get to 25 miles in very quickly, and Sharon said, let's get to Beirut. If we get to Beirut, we can kill Arafat. So never before has Israel gone to a capital city of an Arab country. But because of Sharon, they moved and they went into Beirut. Now they were in the capital. And they knew that Arafat was in a bunker. And Sharon said, okay, Hitler died in a bunker. Arafat's going to die in a bunker. So Sharon was quite tickle pink. Now, what Israel didn't bank on was it was easy to get in, but it was way more difficult to get out, because as Israel were getting further and further and further into Lebanon, what the PLO terrorists were doing, and there were thousands of them and tens of thousands of them, they were, in addition to fighting back, they began to infiltrate Palestinian refugee camps all over the country from Beirut and south. So it was much harder for Israel to get out. So they got in, but to get out, all of a sudden they had these refugee camps, which had been refugee camps, benign. Now they became hostile refugee camps. So the PLO hid, and that's, by the way, that's their playbook. They do this until today. When Gaza, Operation Cast led, where were they shooting the mortars from? In Gaza Strip, they were shooting it from civilian homes. So now Israel bombs a civilian home. You just destroyed. They were shooting them from mosques. Nothing was sacred. So you can't blow up a mosque, because that's an insult. So that was Hamas, but it's their playbook. So from these Palestinian refugee camps, the PLO were attacking Israelis. And anytime Israel, which took a lot of casualties in this war, defended and tried to get rid of PLO terrorists, which were located in Palestinian camps, what happened was some Palestinian civilians were killed. And then Israel was condemned internationally. You killed Palestinian civilians. That's a no-no. But they were being attacked, and that's what was being ignored, and it's constantly ignored by the international community. is they were being attacked from these camps. So and so it was worldwide international condemnation for killing Palestinian civilians. So Israel had that to contend with. Israel also, Arafat, he basically sought international diplomatic help to say that we need to evacuate the bunker. Help us evacuate the bunker without us being destroyed, without us being killed. And the international community gladly, even though Arafat was a terrorist, and an unrepentant terrorist at that, the international community helped Arafat escape. They say that Arafat's head was in the crossfire. He was lying. There was an Israeli soldier, a sniper, that could have taken out Arafat, but they were afraid that the repercussions would have been too harsh. So Arafat lived. Arafat had 9 lives, and he lived till he finally died in Ramallah many, many years later. Now, so the international community evacuated the head of the PLO, Arafat, and all the other high, lofty militants of the PLO, and it was a tremendous cause for celebration. The PLO had to get evacuated. So they're no longer entrenched in Beirut. Another bit of good news happened is that in the general election, a Maronite Christian won. A Muslim, not a Shiite, not a Sunni, a Christian, a Maronite Christian won, which Israel had the alliance. And he was, I forget his first name, but I think his last name was Jamail. General Jamail, he won. And he said, there's going to be peace between Lebanon and Israel. When I take the premiership, when I became the prime minister of Lebanon, there will be peace. Right before he took it, he was assassinated. Who was he assassinated by? He was assassinated by PLO. So that happened on September 15th, 1982. An appointed, an elected leader of a country was assassinated by, it was actually pro-Syrian forces, but it wasn't really PLO, but it was pro-Syrian forces. But once again, the hate for all these groups was so great. So the next day, on 9/16, and this is where it went bad. On 9/16, the day after, right, because it was good news until then. Arafat, he's gone. Who knows where he went? Tunisia, wherever. Jamail won, and then it fell apart. On 9/16, September 16th, 1982, Israel, upon request of the Maronite Christians in West Beirut, they said, allow us to go into these Palestinian refugee camps. We are going to root out the PLO once and for all. We're going to root them out, these terrorists, and we're going to end this. So Israel allowed the Maronite Christians to enter. So it was on 9/16, the Maronite Christians entered the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. And once again, they just wanted to disarm terrorists. And what they did on that day was nothing short of a massacre. There's a debate how many Palestinian refugees were killed, but the lowest number was 300. The average number was anywhere from 800 to 3,500, and they just killed men, women, and children. They massacred them, right? And it was mostly non-PLO that died, that were killed, that were murdered, that were massacred. Mostly non-PLO. And that was a huge mistake by Israel for allowing the Maronites, who they had an alliance with. But it was considered a tremendous mistake, miscarriage of justice, and etc. Israel was horrified, the people of Israel. And they demanded from Begin that Begin make a commission to investigate what happened here. and Begin refused. So on September 25th, 400,000 Israelis, 400,000 Israelis gathered, and they demanded a commission. Right? This is the from the Peace Now movement. So they had a commission. They appointed a former Chief Justice as the head of the investigative commission, and they concluded, which is a fascinating thing if you know the history with the riots in this past summer in many countries in many states in the United States. They concluded that the responsibility is not only on the rioters, but the responsibility is on those that allowed the riots and the killings to happen. That was the conclusion. And it was a moral decision that you can't just say, well, we didn't kill. The fact that you allowed killings to happen like this, you are responsible. There was heads rolled, basically generals. There was many generals and other military higher-ups were fired. And Ariel Sharon, he no longer was the Minister of Defense. He was demoted because of this Sabran Shatila. Now, if you just extrapolate it to what happened in New York City in the summer with I'm not talking about the protests, I'm talking about the riots that were allowed to riot, to burn, I think heads should roll. Where you're talking in Portland, you're talking Seattle, you're talking wherever, you can protest, and you want to have a little skirmish, that's fine. But to riot the way they did and people killed was the moral thing to do is what Israel did. And after all said and done, the Israel kept their troops in Lebanon, but they realized that it's impossible because they're fighting everybody. They're not just fighting the PLO. They're going to be fighting the Sunnis and the Shiites and the PLO and the Palestinians and the Druze and now the Maronites, and 650 Israeli soldiers died, which is just as much, by the way, as the 6-Day War. Right? And for what? For what? They didn't clear out Lebanon. The PLO is still there. And in fact, as of a few years ago, the PLO came down the mountain and they still shelled northern Israel. So nothing was really gained by this war. It was considered I guess it's considered, I don't know if it's considered like America's Vietnam, where there was no, there was nothing gained, but it was considered just a bad thing. That yes, they got to Beirut, and then they had to fight their way to get out of it because the Palestinians, the PLO were in the Palestinian refugee camps, and it was just a mess. But Israel still had a presence on the border to protect the border. And in the year 2000, Ehud Barak finally withdrew all the rest of the troops from the northern border, southern Lebanon, and there was a massacre of Christians because Israel was basically protecting the Christians from revenge. But when Ehud Barak said, we're just getting out of Lebanon, we're going to have a complete withdrawal of Lebanon, and it was called the Good Fence. That's where Israel and Lebanon, it was called the Good Fence because they had the Maronite Christians were friends of Israel, allies of Israel. When Israel finally in 2000, right, the Maronite Christians were begging Israel, we're gonna die. And they try to get into Israel. They try to run to different countries, but Israel just left, turned their back. Ehud Barak's orders, and we were completely out of Lebanon. And whatever happened in Lebanon happens in Lebanon. And there was revenge taken, and they've been feuding ever since, but they were feuding before. So the Lebanese war was actually considered Israel's longest war because it just carried on and on and on, and unfortunately, Lebanon is just as hostile. Now, what happens in Lebanon is that Iran has a lot of there's a lot of Iranian terrorists, Iranian soldiers, same thing, in Lebanon, and they've taken over Lebanon, and one of their goals is to destroy Israel. So every so often there's a skirmish, and every so often Israel has to, by Rosh Hanikra, Israel has to go back in and fight the Nasrallah and fight the Lebanese Iranian army. It's just a mess. It's just a mess. Right now it's quiet, but they still shell. They still shell, and Israel has to go in and kind of be a little aggressive. Then they pull back, and then the Lebanese Iranians get aggressive. So that border, our border with Syria, and our border with Lebanon is still very rocky. Our border with Jordan is not rocky at all. Our border with Egypt is not rocky. Gaza Strip with Hamas is still rocky, and that's pretty much the lay of the land. If you have questions or anything to add, I see we didn't have any comments today, but if you have questions or something to add, by all means add it here. Conversation. Hey Mike, how are you? Miss you too, but conversation we can always have, and if you have any questions, ask here, and we'll all attempt to answer. God bless, and tomorrow we'll continue, please God. Hopefully we'll continue the modern day Israel a little bit further on from 1982. Be well.